He went to live in a village where no one knew his name, pretending to be a pauper, and discovered something no fortune could ever buy. Can you imagine being so rich that you no longer know who truly loves you, and who only loves what you own? This happened in the deep countryside of Alabama in March of 1934, in a little hamlet called Stony Creek. If you are watching this story, leave a comment down below telling me where you're watching from, your city and state. I love knowing where you folks are from, and I always read the comments. And if you haven't subscribed to the channel yet, go ahead and hit that subscribe button and ring the bell, because every week we have a new story of resilience and true love here on Tales of Yesteryear. Robert Thorne was 46 years old when he decided he couldn't take it anymore. He couldn't stand the calculating gazes of the widows at church. He couldn't stomach the friendly visits from families with unmarried daughters, and he could no longer pretend he didn't see the glint of greed in the eyes of everyone who approached him. It had been 2 years since Clara had passed, taken by a fever that not even the best doctor in Birmingham could break. 2 years of silent mourning, of sleepless nights, staring at the empty side of the bed, of mornings waking up and forgetting for a split second that she wasn't there anymore. Robert's main plantation was about 10 miles outside of Birmingham, good cotton land that his father had bought back in 1889 and that Robert had transformed into an empire. 3 estates in total, 200 field hands, ginning houses, and contracts with exporters down in Mobile. The surname Thorne was known throughout the state, and that was exactly the problem. Robert was sitting on the veranda of the big house on a March afternoon when Dr. Thomas Reed came riding up the dirt path. The two had been friends since they were boys, schooling together at the academy in the city. Thomas had become a doctor, a man of balanced science and faith, while Robert had followed his father's footsteps into the fields. But their friendship had weathered the years and the distance. Thomas tied his horse to the hitching post and walked up the porch steps with that determined stride Robert knew well. It meant his friend had come with a purpose, not just for a social call. They sat in the rocking chairs Clara had ordered from Savannah, hickory wood creaking softly in the afternoon silence. Robert poured 2 small glasses of aged bourbon. Thomas accepted and sipped slowly, his eyes studying his friend's face. "You're getting old before your time," the doctor said without preamble. "Clara wouldn't want to see you like this, Rob, transformed into a ghost in your own life." Robert didn't answer immediately. He looked out at the cotton fields stretching as far as the eye could see, white under the strong March sun. The wind carried the scent of dry earth and that sweet perfume of wildflowers announcing the coming harvest. Thomas kept talking. "You're 46, not 80. You have your health, you have means, you have a whole life ahead of you. Clara loved you, but she's gone. And do you honor her memory by living or by dying slowly?" The words stung because they were true. Robert downed the rest of his bourbon, feeling the liquid burn its way down his throat. "I've tried, Thomas," he replied, his voice weary. "Don't you see? Ever since the mourning period ended, it's been a parade. Widow Madeline shows up here every Sunday with a pie. Colonel Augustus's daughter just happens to run into me every time I go into town. Mrs. Francisca already suggested I need a woman to keep the house, all with pretty smiles and eyes calculating exactly what I'm worth." Thomas nodded slowly. "Then find one who doesn't know what you're worth," he suggested, as if offering a simple solution to a complex knot. Robert looked at his friend, wondering if the bourbon had gone to his head. The doctor leaned forward in his chair. "I'm serious, Rob. You want to know if someone loves you for real? Strip away everything that attracts the gold diggers. Take away the name. Take away the apparent fortune. Take away it all. See who comes close when you have nothing to offer but who you are." The idea was absurd. It was risky. It was exactly the kind of crazy plan that made desperate sense to a man tired of being hunted for his last name. Robert spent the following days chewing on it. He thought about it while supervising the harvest, thought about it while reviewing the ledgers, thought about it during solitary meals at a table too big for one man. 2 weeks later, Robert called his lawyer. The man came from Birmingham with a leather briefcase full of documents. Robert explained what he wanted. He needed a simple identity, believable, documented. He wasn't running from the law nor planning fraud. He just wanted to live a few months as a common man in a village where no one knew him. The lawyer, accustomed to the eccentricities of the wealthy, prepared the papers. Robert Cross, widower, owner of a small patch of rocky land, 40 acres, documents registered in a distant county courthouse. Robert chose Stony Creek because it was too small for his name to have reached it, yet big enough to have commerce and a church. It was a 2-day ride from his lands near the state line. He sent Thomas ahead to scout. The doctor returned with intelligence. A village of 300 souls, a stone church in the center, a market on Saturdays, 3 shops, a boarding house, a primary school. Simple folks, farmers, cattle hands, craftsmen. And yes, there were single women and widows. Robert prepared himself like an actor preparing for a role. He set aside simple clothes, patched cotton shirts, faded trousers, an old leather hat. He let his beard grow for a few days. He rehearsed speaking without the polished diction the academy education had engraved in him. He needed to look like a man who had worked hard his whole life and had little to show for it. On an April morning, Robert left his plantation, telling the foreman he would be traveling for a few months to settle some business. He took only a horse, a bundle of clothes, and enough cash for a few months of modest living. Thomas rode with him halfway, then bid him farewell with a tight embrace. "Be careful what you look for, friend," the doctor said. "Sometimes we find more than we bargained for." Robert arrived in Stony Creek on an afternoon of unrelenting sun. The village was exactly as Thomas had described. Simple houses of clapboard and shingle, red dirt roads, a white church dominating the central square. Children ran barefoot chasing chickens, men talked in the shade of the oak trees. Women washed clothes in the creek that cut through the west side of town. Mrs. Euler's boarding house stood on a corner near the church. It was a 2-story house, yellow paint peeling on the walls, a porch with worn chairs. Robert knocked on the door and was greeted by a woman of about 60, thin as a rail, with small, curious eyes that appraised him from head to toe in 3 seconds. Mrs. Euler asked what he wanted. Robert explained he was looking for a room to rent for a few months, that he was a widower and had bought a small plot in the vicinity, that he needed a place to stay while he fixed up the land. The woman nodded, calculated the price out loud, amounts that for Robert Thorne were ridiculously low, but for Robert Cross were significant. He haggled a bit, because a poor man always haggles. They struck a deal. The room was small, iron bed, cornhusk mattress, a table with a basin for washing his face, a small stool. The window looked out onto the street, faded calico curtains. Robert put his bundle on the floor and sat on the bed. The springs groaned. The mattress was hard. There was no mirror, no wardrobe, nothing but the essentials to sleep and wake. It was perfect. In the following days, Robert established his presence in the village. He woke early, had coffee in the boarding house kitchen with the other guests, a peddler and a fabric salesman. He spoke little, listened much, went to the market to buy simple provisions, sat in the square watching the movement, attended Sunday service. The women of Stony Creek began to notice the new widower in town. Mrs. Euler, a certified gossip, spread the basic information. Widower, 40-something, owner of a tiny farm, alone in the world. The candidates began to circle. First was Mrs. Justine, a widow of 50, owner of a dry goods store. She approached Robert at the church exit with a practiced smile, commented on the preacher's sermon, asked if he was liking the village, offered discounts at her store. Robert was polite. The next day, he went to buy at her shop. Mrs. Justine served him with renewed interest until she asked about this farm of his. Robert described it with convincing detail. 40 acres of tired soil, a shack needing repair, no livestock beyond 3 goats. The woman lost the sparkle in her eye, like a candle being snuffed out. "Ah, yes," she commented with sudden coldness. "That's not much land." Robert agreed. "It's what I managed to scrape together in 40 years of work," he said with sincere humility. Mrs. Justine's interest evaporated like water on hot pavement. Then came Lucy, a single woman of 35, the blacksmith's daughter. A pretty face, but sour in spirit, because all the suitors had chosen others. She flirted with Robert in the square. Casual conversations, she always steered toward questions about assets and plans. Robert kept his answers modest: small land, uncertain harvest, simple life. Lucy lasted 3 conversations before making excuses to avoid the poor widower. One by one, the available women of Stony Creek approached and retreated. The pattern was always the same: initial interest, disguised questions about finances, thinly veiled disappointment, polite distancing. Robert observed it all with a mixture of sadness and confirmation. The test was working. Women weren't any different here. Poverty scared off suitors just as effectively as wealth attracted them. Robert began to think Thomas was wrong. Maybe there wasn't a woman who loved a man for who he was, when what he had was so little. Maybe the world functioned only on calculations and conveniences. The loneliness he felt was the kind that aches in the chest, a physical weight of accumulated disappointment. It was on a May afternoon, 2 months after his arrival, that Robert tore his shirt sleeve on a wire fence. The old fabric gave way, opening an ugly rip from shoulder to elbow. Robert needed to fix it but didn't know how to sew. He asked Mrs. Euler if she knew a seamstress in town. The woman thought for a moment and replied that there was Marianne, but with a tone that made it clear she had reservations. "Marianne Foster," Mrs. Euler continued, "lives in that little cabin past the bend in the road, leaving town. She sews well, that she does, but she's a bit peculiar, doesn't mix with folks much." Robert asked why. Mrs. Euler lowered her voice as if sharing a dirty secret. "She has a mark on her face," she explained. "Born like that, ugly to look at. That's why she never married. Had some suitors when she was young, but they all ran off when they saw the children might be born marked too. Today she lives alone, earns her living sewing. Strange folk, but good work." Robert felt uneasy with Mrs. Euler's tone, but he needed the shirt mended. The next day, he walked to the little cabin the woman had described. It was indeed isolated, a small, well-kept structure of clapboard, a garden with flowers resilient to the drought, a porch with a rocking chair. There was order and care there, a sense that someone transformed little into enough. Robert knocked on the door. A female voice from inside asked who it was. He explained he came looking for the seamstress that Mrs. Euler had sent him. The door opened slowly. Marianne Foster was 38 years old but looked younger. Brown hair tied in a simple bun, delicate hands, an upright posture of someone who hadn't bowed despite life's blows. And yes, there was a birthmark covering part of her left cheek and rising to her temple, a dark stain contrasting with her pale skin. But what Robert noticed first were her eyes. Brown, intelligent, guarded behind a caution that came from years of being judged for what she couldn't control. Robert took off his hat out of politeness and explained he had a torn shirt needing mending. Marianne assessed the tear with a professional eye and said she could do it. He asked the price. She answered with a fair value. Robert accepted without bargaining. Marianne seemed surprised by that, as if she expected him to try to pay less. "Come back tomorrow at sundown," she instructed with a voice that was firm but not unkind. Robert returned. The shirt was impeccably sewn, stitches so small and precise one could barely see the patch. He commented on the quality of the work. Marianne accepted the compliment with a slight nod. Without false modesty, but without arrogance. Robert paid and asked if she could make a new shirt as well, that his was getting too old even to patch. Marianne agreed. She would need to take measurements. It was there, on the porch of that small house, with Marianne measuring his shoulders and arms with a worn tape measure, that Robert felt something he hadn't felt since Clara died. It wasn't immediate attraction or sudden passion. It was recognition. As if a part of him identified a part of her, loneliness, recognizing loneliness, rejection, understanding rejection. Marianne worked in concentrated silence, jotting numbers down on a scrap of paper. Robert watched her hands. Hands that created beauty even though the world had denied her that word. She looked up and caught him staring. There was a moment of tension, that fraction of a second, where she expected to see what she always saw. Pity, discomfort, rejection disguised as politeness. But Robert just smiled, a small, genuine smile, and asked if she had any good fabric to recommend. Marianne hesitated, surprise disarming her guard for an instant, then replied she had some Portuguese linen the peddler had brought last month. It was a bit pricier, but lasted years. Robert said he trusted her judgment, and she could choose what she thought best. Something changed in Marianne's face. It wasn't a smile, but the hardening in her expression softened. She said the shirt would be ready in a week. Robert thanked her and walked away down the dirt road, feeling the afternoon sun on his back and thinking that maybe Thomas was right. Maybe there were still surprises hidden where one least expected. Robert returned to Marianne's house a week later, punctually at sundown, as she had asked. The May sun painted the sky orange and pink, those colors the South knows how to make better than any other place on earth. He knocked on the door, and Marianne answered, holding the finished shirt, folded with care. Robert unfolded the garment and examined the work. The stitching was perfect, even and firm, a finish that would make the city tailors envious. The linen fabric was the color of pale sand and felt good in the hands. He put it on right there on the porch, over the old undershirt he was wearing. Marianne watched with the critical eye of an artisan evaluating her own work. The shirt settled on his shoulders as if it had been born there. "It fits perfectly," Robert said with genuine sincerity. Marianne accepted the praise with that slight nod again, but this time there was a shadow of satisfaction in her eyes. She charged the agreed amount. Robert paid and hesitated before leaving. "You've been doing this work a long time?" he asked, trying to extend the conversation. Marianne replied that since she was 15, when her mother had taught her. "Nearly 23 years sewing for the village and surrounding areas." Robert commented that such talent deserved to be better known. Marianne let out a half-smile, bitter. "Talent doesn't do much good when folks don't want to step into your house," she replied with a voice that held no self-pity, just a statement of fact. Robert felt a squeeze in his chest. He asked if he could sit a spell on the porch, that the walk back was long and the sun was still hot. Marianne hesitated, surprised by the request, but agreed. They sat in the 2 rocking chairs Marianne had there. They were simple chairs, hickory wood worn by time and use, but comfortable. The silence between them wasn't awkward. Robert looked at her garden, noticed how the flowers were well tended despite the drought. He commented on it. Marianne explained she watered early morning and late afternoon, using water from the small creek out back. Flowers were her only vanity, she confessed. She liked seeing bright colors in a world that insisted on being brown and grey. The conversation flowed slowly, like water finding a path through stones. Robert asked about the village, about the people, about what it was like living there. Marianne answered with sharp intelligence and precise observations about human nature. She knew everyone, heard all the gossip through the women who came to order clothes, but kept herself out of social circles. She was an invisible observer of her own community. Robert shared a little about himself, or rather, about Robert Cross. He spoke about his widowerhood, about how strange it was to wake up alone after years sharing life with someone. Marianne listened without interrupting. When he finished, she said she understood loneliness. Not the loneliness of losing someone you had, she clarified, but the loneliness of never having had anyone to lose. The words were hard, but the voice was soft, without bitterness. The sun was setting when Robert finally said goodbye. He walked back to the village with the new shirt and a confused mind. There was something about Marianne that attracted him in a way he couldn't completely name. It wasn't just the mirrored loneliness. It was her dignity. The way she didn't apologize for existing, didn't try to hide the mark on her face, nor acted as if she needed to compensate for something. She was simply who she was, without masks and without games. In the following days, Robert invented excuses to go back. First, it was a button he ripped off his trousers, then a hem that came undone. Marianne fixed everything with professional efficiency, but began to look at him with curiosity. "You are very careless with your clothes," she commented, in a tone that had a pinch of humor. Robert laughed and admitted maybe he was a bit clumsy indeed. The visits became part of the routine. Robert showed up always at sundown, when the light was softer and the heat less unrelenting. Sometimes he brought legitimate work, sometimes he just sat on the porch and they talked. Marianne began to expect him. Not that she admitted it out loud, but Robert noticed how she already had 2 clean cups ready, how she offered coffee that was always too fresh to be a coincidence. If you are enjoying this story, subscribe to the channel and leave a like. It helps a lot so that more people can discover these stories of resilience and true love. It was on an especially beautiful late afternoon in June that the conversation took a deeper turn. They were sitting on the porch, drinking coffee, watching the shadows lengthen on the road. Robert asked something he'd been thinking about for days. "Why did you never leave here? A seamstress with your talent could work in Birmingham, even Atlanta. You'd earn more, have more clients." Marianne stayed quiet for a long moment. When she answered, her voice carried the weight of a truth that cost dearly to accept. "Because running away doesn't change what people see when they look at you," she said, looking at her hands resting in her lap. "Big city or small town, the mark stays right here. At least here I have my home, my garden, my peace. I learned that chosen solitude is better than repeated rejection." Robert felt the urge to say that not everyone saw only the mark, that he saw a whole woman when he looked at her. But the words seemed inadequate, insufficient. Instead, he asked if she could teach him to make coffee like hers. Marianne looked up, surprised. "Teach you to make coffee?" He nodded seriously. "I'm tired of the coffee I make. It gets too bitter. Yours tastes right." Marianne studied his face, looking for sarcasm or disguised pity, but found only genuine interest. She got up and signaled for him to follow her into the small kitchen at the back of the house. There she showed the process. The roasted coffee beans she bought from Mr. Tertulliano, the right measure of water, the exact boiling point, the little trick of adding dried orange peel to cut the bitterness. Robert paid attention like a diligent student. The kitchen smelled of coffee and burning wood in the stove. The space was too small for 2 people, so when Marianne turned to grab the orange peel, she bumped into him. It was a brief contact, her shoulder brushing his arm, but both felt it. Marianne moved away quickly, apologizing in a low voice. Robert said there was no problem at all, that it was his fault for being in the way. There was a moment of awkwardness, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of tension that happens when 2 people begin to realize there is something forming between them, something neither expected and neither knows quite how to handle. They went back to the porch with the fresh coffee. They drank in a silence that had a different texture now, heavier with unspoken things. Robert began to notice details about Marianne that had previously gone unnoticed. How she bit her lower lip when she was concentrated on sewing, how her fingers moved with the grace of a pianist manipulating needle and thread, how she tilted her head to the side when thinking of an answer to a difficult question, how her laugh, rare but genuine, had a crystalline sound that made his chest tighten. Marianne also observed Robert. She noticed how he treated everyone with equal respect, from Mrs. Euler to the smallest street urchin. How his hands were calloused from real work, not the hands of a man who never held a hoe. How he listened when she spoke, really listened, not just waiting for his turn to talk. How his eyes never drifted away from the mark on her face. They looked at her wholly, without pretending the mark didn't exist, nor fixing on it with morbid curiosity. The weeks passed, and what was an excuse for visits became an emotional necessity. Robert realized the moments he most looked forward to in the day were those hours in the late afternoon on Marianne's porch. There he didn't need to measure words or calculate impressions. There he could simply be a man talking to a woman, without performances and without masks. But the closer he got to Marianne, the heavier the lie became. Robert Cross didn't exist. The 40-acre farm was an invention. The poor man struggling to survive was a role he was playing, and Marianne knew nothing. She believed he was just like her, someone life hadn't favored, someone who knew struggle and scarcity. Guilt began to gnaw at Robert from the inside like termites destroying wood. He thought about telling the truth several times. He would open his mouth to start and freeze. How to explain without seeming like he was toying with her feelings. How to make Marianne understand that it had started as a test, but had transformed into something real, profound, terrifyingly true. It was in July that Bernard Castle entered the story. Bernard was a merchant in the village, a man of 42, a widower for 6 months. He had 3 children, a prosperous dry goods store, a big house on Main Street. He was a respected man, a deacon in the church with certain influence over the preacher and the other merchants. Bernard's wife had died in childbirth with the 3rd child. The baby had survived, but the mother hadn't. Since then, Bernard was looking for a woman to take care of the house and the children. He wasn't looking for love or romantic company. He was looking for an unpaid employee with the title of wife. Bernard had tested the obvious options first. The most coveted widows and single women of the village had rejected him or demanded conditions he wasn't willing to accept. He wanted a woman grateful for the opportunity, a woman who wouldn't question his authority, a woman who knew her place. And his attention had fallen on Marianne. Robert was at John's general store buying tobacco when he heard the conversation. Bernard was speaking loudly, like a man accustomed to being heard. He was telling the group of men gathered there that he had decided to marry again. Someone asked who. Bernard replied he hadn't asked yet, but he was thinking of the seamstress, Marianne Foster. The men reacted with surprise and some stifled chuckles. Bernard raised his voice defensively. It was a practical choice, he explained. Marianne was a serious woman, hard-working, without family to interfere, without pretensions of grandeur. She would take good care of the children and the house, and would be grateful for the opportunity to finally have a husband and social status. The mark on her face didn't matter, Bernard said with false generosity, because he was a man who saw beyond appearances. Robert felt rage rise like bile in his throat. He had to clench his fists not to cross the store and smash Bernard's satisfied face. The man was talking about Marianne as if she were a horse being evaluated for purchase. Worse, he was acting as if he were doing an immense favor by considering her, as if she should kneel in gratitude for the chance to be an unpaid servant in his house. Robert left the store before he lost control. He walked straight to Marianne's house. It was the middle of the afternoon, earlier than his usual time, but he couldn't wait. He needed to know if Bernard had already spoken to her, needed to warn her about the type of man he was. Marianne was sewing on the porch when Robert arrived hurriedly. She looked up, surprised by the time and the expression on his face. "Something happened?" she asked, already getting up from the chair. Robert tried to control the urgency in his voice. Did Bernard Castle speak to you? Marianne furrowed her brow in confusion. Bernard from the store? No. Why? Robert took a deep breath, trying to organize his thoughts. He told her what he had heard at the store, trying to be careful with the words, but keeping the essence. Marianne listened with an expression that went from surprise to comprehension, and finally to weary resignation. When Robert finished, she sat back down in the sewing chair slowly. So he's going to ask for my hand, Marianne said with a flat voice. Robert nodded. But not because he loves you, Marianne, because he needs a maid. Marianne looked at her hands, at the forgotten needle and fabric. I know that, Robert, she replied calmly. Do you think I'm an idiot? I know exactly what men like Bernard see when they look at a woman like me. Convenience, practical solution, an option that won't reject him because she has no better options. The bitterness in her voice cut Robert like a sharp blade. He knelt beside her chair, a gesture Marianne didn't expect. He looked into her brown eyes and said with an intensity that surprised them both, You have options, Marianne. You always have the option to say no, to choose dignified solitude instead of a humiliating marriage. You are worth more than that. Marianne held his gaze. Am I? She asked with a low voice. Am I really, Robert? Because the world doesn't seem to agree with you. I'm already 38. No one ever wanted me. And now a man appears, offering social respect, security, purpose. Maybe that's the most a woman like me can hope for. Robert squeezed her hands between his. The words came out before he could weigh the consequences. It's not the most. You deserve a man who sees you for real, who loves your intelligence, your humor, your strength, who wakes up every day grateful that you exist. You deserve to be loved, Marianne. Truly loved. The silence that fell between them was heavy with meaning. Marianne looked at Robert with an expression that mixed hope and fear. And do you know a man like that? She asked, her voice almost a whisper. A man who would see me that way? Robert knew he was at the edge of a precipice. He could retreat, pretend he was speaking in general terms, keep a safe distance, or he could jump. I do, he answered without averting his eyes. I do indeed. Marianne held her breath. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Then she pulled her hands away gently, distancing herself. Robert, she said with a controlled voice, despite the tremor at the edges, you are a good man, but you are also a poor man trying to survive on 40 acres of tired land. You can't offer what Bernard offers, security, guaranteed food, a big house, social respect. Robert felt as if he had been punched in the gut, because she was right. Robert Cross, the character he created, had nothing to offer but love. And the world didn't accept love as valid currency. But Robert Thorne had everything. 3 plantations, houses, money, a respected name. He could give Marianne everything she deserved and more. And he couldn't tell her. Because if he told her now, after this conversation, after making his feelings clear, Marianne would think he was offering money as a solution. She would think he felt pity. Or worse, she would think he had toyed with her during all these months, that he had tested her as if she were a scientific experiment. The truth that should set free had become a prison. Robert stood up slowly. The distance between them was physical now, yards of porchwood, but it seemed impassable. He said he understood, that he didn't want to pressure her, that he only wanted the best for her. Marianne thanked him with formal politeness that hurt more than anger would have. Robert left with a heavy heart and a mind in torment. In the following days, Bernard made his move. He showed up at Marianne's house on a Saturday afternoon, dressed in his best suit, hat in hand. He spoke with her on the porch, a marriage proposal that sounded more like a job offer. She would take care of his children, the house, the meals. In exchange, she would have a respectable surname, social standing, financial security. He was generous, he said. He didn't mind her appearance. He was a practical man who saw value in hard work and loyalty. Marianne listened to everything without interrupting. When Bernard finished, she asked for time to think. Bernard granted a week. After all, he added with a smile that tried to be charming but came out condescending, he understood that a woman in her position needed to carefully consider an opportunity like this. The news spread through the village with the speed of fire in dry grass. Mrs. Euler was one of the first to mention it to Robert during breakfast. Bernard asked Marianne to marry him, the woman announced with the tone of someone sharing juicy gossip. She'd be a fool to refuse. A woman like her won't get a better offer. Truth is, it's luck anyone wants to marry her. Robert felt the anger again, but swallowed it with bitter coffee. He spent the day trying to work on his supposed farm, but couldn't concentrate. He returned to the village in the late afternoon and went straight to Marianne's house. She was in the garden, watering the flowers. She looked at him with a tired expression. "Did you come to try to convince me to refuse?" she asked. Before Robert said anything, he stopped at the small wooden gate. "I came to ask what you truly want," he replied. "Not what is practical, not what the village expects. What you, Marianne, want deep in your heart." Marianne turned off the water and set down the watering can. She walked to the edge of the garden, standing a few steps from Robert with only the low fence between them. "What I want doesn't matter," she said with a controlled voice. "The world doesn't work based on what women like me want. It works based on what is possible, on what is offered, on what you can grab before it disappears." "And if it were possible to have what you want," Robert insisted, "if you could choose any life, any future, what would it be?" Marianne looked at him for a long time. The late afternoon light made the mark on her face seem softer, but her eyes were hard with defenses built over decades. "I wanted to be seen," she answered finally, "really seen, not as a problem to solve, not as a last resort option, not as a charity project. Seen as a woman who has her own value, seen as someone who deserves to be chosen, not tolerated." Her voice broke a little on the last word. Robert gripped the fence with both hands, rough old wood under his palms. "I see you, Marianne," he said with an intensity that made her take a step back. "I see you exactly as you are. And what I see is an extraordinary woman, intelligent, strong, talented, brave, a woman who didn't let the world break her heart even though it tried. A woman that I—" He stopped. The words were dangerous. Once spoken, they couldn't be undone. "A woman that you what?" asked Marianne with a voice that was half fear, half hope. "A woman that I could love," completed Robert, "that I am already loving." The silence fell like a physical weight. Marianne looked at Robert with wide eyes, breathing fast. Robert continued before his courage failed. "I know I don't have much to offer. I know Bernard can give you a big house and a respected name. But I can give you something he will never give. I can give you true love. I can make you happy. I can wake up every day for the rest of my life treating you like the gift that you are." Marianne shook her head slowly, tears beginning to gather in her eyes. "Robert, you don't understand. It's not just about what you offer. It's about what the whole village is saying, that I'd be crazy to refuse Bernard, that I'll never have a better chance, that a woman my age and with my appearance can't choose for love. There's Mrs. Euler, Mrs. Justine, the preacher, everyone saying I need to accept." Social pressure was a real force, Robert knew. In a small village, collective opinion could be as oppressive as physical chains, and he couldn't fight it with the resources of Robert Cross without revealing who he really was. Robert Cross had no social power, no influence, nothing but words. "And words don't sustain anyone," said Marianne, as if reading his thoughts. "Words don't buy food, don't provide a roof, don't protect from gossip. Bernard is offering me a practical and safe life. You're offering me feelings, and feelings aren't enough when you're 38 and have no other option." Robert felt despair growing. "Say you feel nothing for me," he pleaded. Look me in the eye and say these months meant nothing, that the conversations, the coffees, the silences, it was all just a seamstress being polite to a customer. Say that and I'll walk away. I'll never bother you again. Marianne closed her eyes. A tear escaped and ran down her cheek, tracing a path along the side of the mark. When she opened her eyes again, they were full of pain. "I can't say that," she whispered, "because it would be a lie. These months were the happiest of my life, Robert. You made me feel seen, feel alive, feel as if I mattered. But temporary happiness doesn't change permanent reality. I'm still a marked woman without family and without a future. And you are still a good but poor man who can't give me what the world says I need." Robert opened his mouth to protest, to scream that he could give everything, that Robert Thorne had 3 plantations and enough money to buy the entire village if he wanted, but the words stuck in his throat. Because revealing it now, in this context, would make it seem like he was buying her. It would transform love into a transaction. Exactly what Bernard was doing, just with different values. The door of the prison he had built himself closed completely. Robert nodded slowly, defeat weighing on his shoulders. "I understand," he said with a hoarse voice. "You have to do what is best for you. Just don't give the answer yet. Wait until the end of the week he gave you. Please." Marianne promised she would wait. Robert walked away down the road as night fell, feeling for the second time in his life what it was to lose the woman he loved. But this time, the loss was his fault, constructed by well-intentioned lies that had become an inescapable trap. That night, lying on the hard bed at the boarding house, Robert made a decision. He couldn't let Marianne marry Bernard out of pressure and resignation. Not when she had confessed to feeling something for him. He needed to reveal the truth. But he needed to do it in a way that she understood it wasn't about money, that it had never been about testing her, that everything had started wrong, but had become the most right thing in his life. He would spend the next few days planning how to tell, how to make Marianne see that Robert Cross was a mask, but the feelings were real, that the poverty was faked, but the love was true. How to prove that he wasn't offering a fortune as a solution, he was offering his heart as a foundation. But fate and Bernard Castle had other plans, and those plans would force the revelation in a way no one was prepared for. The next 3 days were the longest of Robert's life. He tried several times to go to Marianne's house, but always stopped halfway. The words he needed to say were too complicated, too loaded. How to explain months of lies without sounding like a man who toyed with her feelings. How to reveal a fortune without seeming like he was buying a solution to a problem he created himself. On the morning of the 4th day, Robert woke up with his mind made up. He would go to Marianne that afternoon, tell everything from the beginning, from the pain of being hunted for money to the moment he realized he had truly fallen in love. He would let her decide if she could forgive, if she could trust, if she could believe the feelings were real, even when the circumstances were false. But when he went down for coffee at the boarding house, Mrs. Euler had news that changed everything. Marianne accepted Bernard's proposal, the woman announced, with the satisfaction of someone who always knew it would be so. He stopped by there last night, and she said yes. They're going to announce it officially on Sunday after church. Wedding should be next month. Robert felt the floor disappear beneath his feet. Marianne had promised to wait until the end of the week. There were still 3 days left. Why had she accepted sooner? The answer came quick and painful, because she was cutting it off at the root before her courage failed. Choosing security before her heart could convince her head otherwise. Robert couldn't eat. He left the boarding house walking aimlessly, trying to process the information. Passed by the church, the square, the dirt streets he had traversed so many times in recent months. Everything looked different now, colors faded, sounds muffled, as if the world had lost definition. It was when he was coming back that he heard raised voices coming from John's general store. It was mid-afternoon, a time when men gathered to escape the sun and talk business and politics. Robert was going to walk right past when he heard Marianne's name. He entered the store. The usual group was there, including Bernard Castle in the centre, loud voice and victorious tone. He was telling about the accepted proposal, about how he had chosen well, about how Marianne would be a suitable wife. Someone made a joke about the mark on her face. Bernard laughed and replied that in the dark all cats are grey, provoking guffaws from the group. Something snapped inside Robert. All the weeks of control, of measuring, of caution evaporated in a second. He crossed the store in 3 strides and grabbed Bernard by the collar of his shirt, shoving the man against the counter with a force that made bottles rattle. "Repeat what you said," Robert ordered with a low, dangerous voice. Bernard, surprised and frightened by the sudden violence, tried to break free. Robert squeezed tighter. "Repeat it," he insisted. "Say again how you see the woman who is going to marry you." The other men stood up, some trying to separate them, others just watching. John, the store owner, asked for calm. Robert ignored him. He looked into Bernard's eyes with an intensity that made the merchant recoil. "You think you're doing her a favor, don't you? You think she should thank you on her knees because a man like you is willing to tolerate a woman like her." Bernard recovered some of his arrogance. "Let me go, Cross," he hissed. "You have no right to judge me. I'm offering an honest marriage, a home, respect. What do you offer? 40 acres of land that barely feed a dog. You're jealous because you know you could never give her what I give." Robert could have punched Bernard's satisfied face. His fists itched to do it. But violence wouldn't resolve anything, so he did something he hadn't planned, something that would change everything irreversibly. He released Bernard and took 2 steps back. "You want to know what I can give her?" he asked with a voice that cut through the side conversations. He pulled from the inside pocket of his shirt the documents he always carried. True documents, not the fake ones of Robert Cross. He spread them on John's counter. Property deeds. 3 plantations registered at the courthouse. Full name in official lettering. Robert Thorne. Landowner since 1903. The silence that fell in the store was absolute. The men approached to see the papers, to verify if they were real. John, who could read well, picked up one of the deeds and examined it carefully. "It's true," he murmured with an incredulous voice. "These are legitimate deeds. 3 plantations near Birmingham, over 2,000 acres combined." Bernard looked at the documents as if they had appeared out of thin air. "You," he started without being able to complete the sentence. Robert confirmed. "I am not who I said I was. I am not a poor farmer. I am a cotton planter. I came here pretending to be poor because I was tired of women hunting me for money. I wanted to know if anyone would see me for the man I am, not for what I have." Someone laughed nervously in the back of the store. Another whistled low. Mrs. Euler, who had appeared in the doorway attracted by the commotion, brought a hand to her chest dramatically. Bernard found his voice. "So you lied," he accused, "pretended to be poor, fooled everyone. And now you think you can buy Marianne by flashing your papers." Robert put the deeds away slowly. "I'm not trying to buy anyone," he replied with forced calm. "I am proving that I can give her everything you offer and more. A big house, security, respect. But unlike you, I also give something money can't buy. I give true love. I give genuine respect. I see her as an extraordinary woman, not as a convenient solution." Bernard turned red with anger and humiliation. "You have no right," he shouted. "She already accepted my proposal, already gave her word. It's too late to show up with your lies and your plantations. The whole village is a witness. Marianne is going to marry me." Robert looked around at the gathered men. "Witnesses," he repeated. "You saw Bernard talking about her 5 minutes ago. saw how he laughs at her appearance, how he treats her like an object, how he acts as if he were doing charity. And you are going to let this woman marry a man who doesn't respect her? Are you going to stay silent while she trades a whole life for false security? John scratched his grey beard. The fella has a point, he said slowly. Bernard, we all heard what you said. It wasn't pretty. Robert looked at the store owner with gratitude. But the decision was Marianne's, John continued. She's an adult, a free woman. If she accepted Bernard, it was her choice. She accepted because she thinks she has no better option, Robert argued, because the whole village spent months saying a woman like her can't choose for love, because she believes she needs to accept whatever is offered before nothing else comes along. But she has an option. She always did. Bernard spat on the floor with contempt. Option? You mean you? A man who lied for months, who pretended to be poor to test people like they were carnival animals? What kind of option is that? At least I was honest from the start. At least she knows exactly what to expect from me. Bernard's words hit Robert dead on, because they carried truth. He had lied. He had tested. He had played with people's perceptions, including Marianne's, and now he was there revealing everything in public without having given her a chance to hear it first, to process it in privacy, to decide without an audience. Robert realized the enormous mistake he had just made. He should have gone straight to Marianne, should have told her first, in private, with time and space for her to react however she wanted. Instead, he had turned an intimate revelation into a public spectacle. He had exposed his secret and their relationship to the gossip of the entire village. He needed to fix this. Robert left the store almost running, leaving Bernard yelling after him and the men commenting in agitated voices. He crossed the village in quick strides, took the path that led to Marianne's house. The afternoon sun was unforgiving, heat beating on the top of his head, but Robert barely felt it. His heart beat fast, a mixture of fear and urgency. When he arrived at Marianne's house, the door was closed. Robert knocked. "Marianne," he called, "please, open the door. I need to talk to you." Silence. He knocked again. "Marianne, I know you must know. The news must have arrived. But let me explain." "Please." The door opened abruptly. Marianne was there, face wet with tears, eyes red from crying. She looked at Robert with a mixture of pain and anger he had never seen in her. "Explain," she repeated with a trembling voice. "You want to explain how you lied to me for months? How you pretended to be poor, to test me as if I were an experiment? How you toyed with my feelings while laughing inside at the idiot seamstress who believed someone could like her for real?" Robert shook his head vigorously. "It wasn't like that, Marianne. It was never like that. Let me come in, let me tell it right." Marianne laughed without humor. "Tell what? More lies? More made-up stories? Mrs. Justine came by here 10 minutes ago. She loved telling me all the details. How you owned 3 plantations, how you are rich, how you came here pretending to be poor to see who was a gold digger. Congratulations, Robert. Or should I call you Mr. Thorne now? You got what you wanted, found someone stupid enough not to notice the test." The words came out poisoned with pain. Robert felt each one like a stab wound. "You aren't stupid," he said with desperation in his voice. "You are extraordinary, and I wasn't testing you specifically. I didn't even know you when I arrived here. The test was for everyone, for the whole world that only saw me as a walking fortune. But then I met you and everything changed." "Changed?" asked Marianne with a loud voice. "Changed so much that you kept lying, that you let me tell my secrets, my fears, my whole life while you hid who you really were? Changed so much that you watched me accept a proposal from a man I don't love because I thought I had no better option, and still didn't tell the truth?" Robert had no defense for that. She was right. He had had hundreds of opportunities to tell. Every afternoon on her porch, every honest conversation, every moment of growing connection. and he had chosen to keep the lie because he was afraid. Afraid of losing what he was building, afraid she wouldn't understand, afraid of turning something precious into a calculated transaction. "I was afraid," admitted Robert in a low voice. "Afraid you would think I was playing. Afraid you wouldn't believe the feelings were real. Afraid of ruining the only good thing I found in years. But I should have told you. You deserved to know, and I ask forgiveness for not having had the courage before." Marianne wiped the tears from her face with the back of her hand. "Forgiveness," she repeated bitterly. "You think forgiveness solves months of lying? You think I can simply forget that everything we lived was based on falsehood? Every conversation, every coffee, every moment I thought we were getting to know each other for real was a lie. You knew everything about me and I knew nothing about you. You know what matters," insisted Robert, taking a step forward. "You know I respect you. You know I value you. You know I see you as the incredible woman you are. That wasn't a lie, Marianne. My name might be different, my assets might be different, but my feelings were always true." Marianne shook her head slowly. "How am I to know what is truth and what is a lie? How can I trust anything you say? You built an entire character, a whole fake life. You're such a good actor that you fooled me completely. How do I know that the man who says he loves me isn't just another role you are playing?" The question was legitimate, and Robert had no easy answer. Broken trust isn't mended with pretty words. It needed time, consistent actions, repeated proof. But Marianne didn't seem willing to give time. She took a step back, hand on the door, ready to close it. "Go away, Robert, or Thorne, or whoever you really are. Go away and leave me in peace." "No," refused Robert. "I won't go away, not until you understand that I love you. I love you, Marianne. Not the seamstress, not the rejected woman, not the solution to my loneliness. I love you, your intelligence, your humor, your kindness, your strength. I love how you tend the flowers even in the drought. I love how you sew with dedication that turns work into art. I love how you never lost your gentleness, even though the world was cruel. I love every part of you, and I know I have no right to say this after everything. I know I ruined any chance I had, but I can't let you marry Bernard without knowing there is a man here who loves you for real." Marianne was crying again, tears flowing silently as she held the door. "And I wanted to believe you," she whispered. "I wanted so much to believe that someone could see me that way. But you destroyed that, Robert. You turned something precious into a farce, and I don't know if I can forgive." She closed the door. Robert stood there, staring at the old wood, listening to the muffled sobs on the other side. Every fiber of his body wanted to break down the door, enter, hold Marianne until she believed, but he didn't have that right anymore. He had lost the right when he chose a lie instead of the truth. If you are following this story, leave a like and share it with someone who needs to believe in true love. Robert returned to the village slowly, heavy feet, soul even heavier. The news had spread completely. People looked at him differently now. With respect born of money, with curiosity about his motivations, with judgment about his choices. Mrs. Euler was at the door of the boarding house when he arrived, arms crossed, and an expression of someone who had many questions. "You fooled us all," she accused bluntly. Robert nodded tiredly. "I did," he confirmed, "and I'm paying the price for it." The woman studied his face. "Do you love her for real?" she asked more quietly. "Or was that also part of the game?" Robert looked into her eyes. "I love her more than anything in this world," he replied with absolute conviction. "And I lost her through my own stupidity." Mrs. Euler let out a breath slowly. "Then you have work ahead of you," she said without pity but without cruelty, "because Marianne spent her whole life being wounded, and you just added a new wound to the many she already carries. If you are a real man, you're going to have to prove it. Not with money, not with promises, with time and actions." Robert knew she was right. He went up to the small room that had been his home for months, lay on the hard bed and looked at the stained ceiling. He had come to Stony Creek looking for true love. He had found exactly that, and he had destroyed it with his own hands out of fear and pride disguised as protection. Night fell, and Robert couldn't sleep. He lay thinking, planning, trying to find a way to fix what he had broken. By morning he had a plan. It wasn't perfect, maybe it wouldn't even work, but it was all he had. He got up early and went to Marianne's house. He didn't knock on the door. Instead, he sat on the floor of the porch, leaning against the wall, and stayed there. When Marianne opened the door hours later to get water from the creek, she found Robert sitting there. He looked up at her. "I won't force you to talk to me," he said calmly. "I won't pressure you or chase you, but I won't give up either. I'm going to stay here until you agree to listen to me for real. Could be today, could be next week, could be next month. I'll wait." Marianne looked at him with an expression that mixed disbelief and something that might be guarded hope. "You're going to sit on my porch?" she asked. Robert nodded. "I am." Marianne shook her head. "That's ridiculous," she murmured. But she didn't tell him to leave. She got the water and went back inside, closing the door without another word. Robert stayed. The sun rose and grew hot. He didn't move. Noon came with unrelenting heat. Mrs. Euler appeared, bringing a canteen of water and some cornbread. She handed it to Robert without comment and left, shaking her head. Robert ate and drank, grateful. In the late afternoon, the door opened again. Marianne came out bringing a cup of coffee. She placed it beside him without looking him in the eye and went back inside. Robert took the coffee and drank slowly, savoring every sip. It was her coffee, made the way she had taught him. It meant she didn't hate him completely. There was hope in that cup. The second day was the same. Robert sitting on the porch, Marianne avoiding looking at him. But in the late afternoon, she came out and sat in the rocking chair. They stayed in silence for a long time. Then Marianne spoke without looking at him. "Why don't you go away? You've already proved you can buy any woman you want. Why waste time with one who doesn't want you?" "Because I don't want just any woman," Robert replied. "I want you." "And you want me too, Marianne. I know you do. I felt it in the coffees we drank, in the conversations we had, in the silences we shared. You felt a connection as strong as I felt. And it wasn't with Robert Cross or Robert Thorne. It was with the man I am beneath the names and the circumstances." Marianne finally looked at him. "And who is that man?" "A widower who loved his wife and never thought he would love again. A man who got tired of being hunted for fortune instead of being loved for character. A man who made a huge mistake trying to protect a heart that had already been broken before. A man who found an extraordinary woman and was afraid to lose her by telling the truth. A man who is learning that true love cannot be built on lies, no matter how well-intentioned." Robert's voice was low but firm. Marianne listened to it all. When he finished, she stayed quiet for a long time. "You hurt me," she said finally. "Hurt me more than all the others because I believed in you. I thought you were different. And discovering that you were also pretending, were testing, were measuring my value like everyone else always did, that destroyed something in me." "I never measured your value," protested Robert. "You were always invaluable to me. Since the first time I saw how your eyes shined when you talked about the flowers, since the first time I heard your laugh, since the first time you treated me like a complete man instead of a problem or an opportunity. You saw me, Marianne, and I saw you. The rest was circumstance that I handled wrongly, but that never changed the essential." Marianne stood up from the chair. "I need time," she said with a tired voice. "Time to think, to feel, to decide if I can trust again. You can keep coming here if you want, but I can't promise anything." Robert nodded. "I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for a chance." Days turned into a week. Robert kept showing up every morning, sat on the porch, waited. Sometimes Marianne came out and they talked, cautious conversations laden with care, where Robert answered every question she asked. About his real life, about Clara, about the plantations, about why he had done what he did. He didn't hide anything anymore. Every truth was offered without defense and without excuse. Bernard showed up on the fourth day, riding up to Marianne's house with indignation stamped on his face. He found Robert on the porch. "You're still here," he spat with contempt. "Think you can buy forgiveness with persistence? Marianne already said yes to me. She is my fiancée." Robert looked at him calmly. "Marianne is nobody's property. She can change her mind whenever she wants, and something tells me she's already thinking about it." Bernard banged on the door, demanding to speak to Marianne. She came out with a closed expression. Bernard began to speak about commitment, about given word, about the public shame of breaking an engagement. Marianne listened to him without interrupting. When he finished, she said with a firm voice that she needed more time to think, that she couldn't marry without being absolutely sure. Bernard turned red with rage. "This is because of him," he accused, pointing at Robert, "because of this liar who toyed with you. You prefer a man who deceived the whole village to an honest man who offered you a dignified future?" Marianne straightened her shoulders. "I prefer a man who loves me with flaws to a man who tolerates me with honesty," she replied. "And I haven't decided which of the two you are yet, Bernard. But I will decide in my time, not yours." Bernard left furious. Robert felt pride swell in his chest. Marianne had defended herself, had claimed autonomy, had refused to be pressured. She was stronger than ever, and Robert realized that part of that came from the pain he had caused. Sometimes breaking forces a person to rebuild stronger. It was in the second week that Marianne finally invited Robert inside the house. He sat on the simple chair in the small parlor while she prepared coffee. When she returned with the cups, she sat across from him and said she had made a decision. Robert's heart raced, fear and hope warring in his chest. Marianne took a deep breath. "I can't marry Bernard," she began. "Not after everything. Not after knowing there is a possibility of something real. But I also can't simply forgive you and pretend nothing happened. You hurt me deeply, Robert, and broken trust isn't fixed overnight." Robert nodded. "I know, and I'm not asking you to pretend. I'm asking you to give me a chance to rebuild that trust, day by day, action by action, truth by truth, for as long as necessary." Marianne held the cup with both hands. "And if I give that chance and you hurt me again? Then you walk away and I'll spend the rest of my life knowing I lost the best thing that ever happened to me," replied Robert with brutal honesty. "But I won't hurt you again, Marianne. I learned my lesson the worst way possible. There is no secret worth losing you. There is no test worth risking what we have." Marianne drank the coffee slowly, thinking. Finally, she set the cup aside. "All right," she said with a low voice. "I give you a chance. But there are conditions." Robert agreed, even before hearing what they were. "First condition," Marianne continued, "you go back to your plantations, go back to your real life, and if after being there in your world you still feel the same, come back and we'll talk." Robert began to protest, but Marianne raised her hand. "I need to know that you want me in your real world," she explained. "Not in the invented world where we were equal in circumstances. I want to know if the rich planter who has everything will still want the marked seamstress when he goes back to where he belongs." Robert took her hands in his. "I will want you," he promised. "I will want you today, tomorrow, always. But I'll do as you ask. I'll go back to prove it." "Second condition," said Marianne, "you don't break my engagement with Bernard publicly. I do that. My way, in my time. I don't want people to think you bought me or convinced me." "I want them to know it was my decision," Robert agreed again, Third condition. When you come back, if you come back, we start over. For real. No lies, no tests, no games. You know me as Robert Thorne, and I know you as who you really are. Robert squeezed her hands. I accept all the conditions, and I will prove I deserve the chance you are giving. Marianne pulled her hands away gently. Then go, she said, with a voice that held unshed tears. Go before I change my mind. Robert stood up slowly. He kissed her forehead, a soft and respectful gesture. I'll be back, he promised. And when I come back, it will be forever. Robert left Stony Creek the next day. He rode back to his lands with a heart divided between the pain of separation and the hope of the future. When he arrived at the main plantation, he was greeted with joy by the foreman and the workers who had missed him. The big house was as he had left it, clean and tidy, but empty of life. For 3 months, Robert dedicated himself to work, supervised harvest, negotiated contracts, took care of the lands. But every night, sitting on the veranda where he used to sit with Clara, he thought of Marianne, of her rare laugh, of her intelligent eyes, of her skilled hands creating beauty, of how she had transformed a small cabin into a home full of flowers and light, of how he wanted that for his life, wanted her for his life. In the middle of the 3rd month, Robert couldn't take it anymore. He called Dr. Thomas and told him everything. The friend listened to the full story, shaking his head at some moments, smiling at others. When Robert finished, Thomas said he had been an idiot, but an idiot with his heart in the right place. Now go fetch your woman, ordered the doctor, and don't come back without her. Robert returned to Stony Creek on a September morning. The village was the same dirt streets, same white church, same people, but he was different. He wasn't Robert Cross pretending poverty, nor Robert Thorne hiding behind a mask. He was simply Robert, a man who had erred and learned, who had loved and lost and was fighting to love again. He went straight to Marianne's house. She was in the garden, as always, tending the flowers. When she heard his footsteps on the road, she looked up. They stood looking at each other for a long moment. Then Marianne dropped the watering can and walked to the gate. You came back, she said, not as a question. Robert nodded. I came back, and I'm not leaving again without you. Marianne opened the gate. Come in, she invited. They sat on the porch in the same rocking chairs that had been witnesses to so many conversations. Robert told her about the 3 months, about how he had thought of her every day, about how the big plantation and the beautiful house seemed empty without her, about how he had realized that home wasn't a place, it was a person, and she was his home. Marianne listened to everything. When he finished, she told him she had broken the engagement with Bernard 2 weeks after Robert had left, had done it publicly, in front of the church, explaining she couldn't marry without love. The village had gossiped for weeks, but she didn't care anymore. She had discovered that the opinion of others weighed less than the peace of her own conscience. And you? Asked Robert carefully. Did you think of me in these months? Marianne smiled, the first complete smile he saw on her since the revelation. I thought of you every day, she admitted. Questioned if I was doing right to wait, if I was being an idiot to believe, if I was preparing myself for a new disappointment. But the stubborn heart didn't want to give up on you. Robert knelt in front of her like he had done months ago, but this time without a fence between them. He took her hands and looked into the brown eyes that had haunted his dreams. Marianne Foster, he said with a firm voice, I love you. I love you completely and perfectly. I love your strengths and your vulnerabilities. I love your courage and your fears. I love every day I lived with you, and every day I am still going to live. Marry me, not because you need security or because I need company, but because we choose each other. Because true love always chooses, never resigns itself. Marianne had tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears this time. I love you too, she whispered. I love you even having every reason not to. I love despite the pain, despite the fear, despite everything. And yes, I'll marry you. I marry because I choose you, because I trust again, because I believe we can build something true on top of the ruins of what broke." Robert pulled her into a tight embrace. Marianne buried her face in his shoulder and cried, releasing months of tension and pain and guarded hope. Robert held her as if she were the most precious treasure in the world, because that was exactly what she was. The wedding happened 6 months later, in March of 1935, a full year after Robert had arrived in Stony Creek for the first time. It was a simple ceremony in the village church, but there were people from Birmingham, friends of Robert, Dr. Thomas, his best man, even some workers from the plantations who had insisted on coming. Marianne wore a white dress she had sewn herself, simple but elegant, that fell perfectly on her body. She didn't try to hide the mark on her face, didn't use a heavy veil nor excessive makeup. She was there exactly as she was. And when she entered the church on the arm of John, who had offered to play the role of the father she never had, she was radiant. Robert waited at the altar with a heart overflowing. When Marianne arrived at his side, he held her hands and whispered that she was beautiful. She smiled, that complete and true smile, and whispered back that he was too. The preacher conducted the ceremony. When the moment for the vows came, Robert and Marianne spoke words they had written together. Words about second chances, about forgiveness, about love that chooses even when it would be easier to give up. When the preacher declared them husband and wife, the kiss Robert and Marianne shared sealed not just the marriage, but the entire journey they had traveled, a journey of pain transformed into healing, of loneliness transformed into companionship, of lies transformed into absolute truth. The reception was at Robert's main plantation. The big house had been prepared to receive the new mistress, rooms tidied, flowers in every corner. When Robert carried Marianne through the door, following old tradition, she looked around in wonder. "It's so big," she murmured. "I'll manage to fill it with life," promised Robert. "With you, with love, maybe with more people in the future." Marianne blushed but smiled. The following years were of happiness built day by day. Marianne adapted to the life of a planter's wife with natural grace. She didn't try to pretend to be something she wasn't, didn't try to hide her humble origins. On the contrary, she used her skills to improve the lives of the families who worked on the lands. She taught the women to sew better, created a small craft trade that gave them extra income, organized an informal school for the children. The mark on her face that had been her curse her whole life became part of her admired identity. People didn't see a defect anymore. They saw Mrs. Thorne, a woman of immense heart and talented hands, a beloved and respected wife. They saw Marianne. Robert kept every promise he had made. He treated Marianne like a queen every day of their lives, never let her forget she was loved, chosen, valued. He had learned that true love doesn't test, doesn't measure, doesn't hide. True love trusts and is transparent and chooses every day. 3 years after the wedding, in 1938, Robert and Marianne transformed part of the property into a shelter for needy folks. It wasn't exactly an orphanage, because it welcomed not just children, but also adults who needed a fresh start. Widows without homes, injured workers, families fleeing the hard times. The house they built there had a door always open and a table always full. It was Marianne's idea. She told Robert that both of them had been rejected and lonely their whole lives, each in their own way. And now that they had found a home in each other, they wanted to offer that to more people. Robert agreed completely. The shelter became their legacy, a place of second chances and unconditional love. Mrs. Euler visited the plantation a few years later, curious to see how they were living. She found Marianne supervising the renovation of the shelter, giving orders with natural authority, laughing with the workers. The woman who had been invisible in Stony Creek was now the center of everything. Mrs. Euler commented on the transformation. Marianne smiled and said she hadn't transformed. She had just found a space where she could be complete. Robert, listening to the conversation from afar, felt deep gratitude. Gratitude for having come to that small village, for having met that extraordinary woman, for having committed mistakes that taught him essential truths. Gratitude for Marianne having given a second chance, for having chosen love despite fear, for having built a beautiful life on top of an imperfect beginning. They grew old together, Robert and Marianne, grey hair, wrinkles marking faces, hands spotted by time. But the love between them only grew. Love that had been tested in fire and come out stronger. Love that chose every day, in every small gesture, in every kind word, in every shared look. Decades later, when grandchildren ran through the plantation and the shelter they had created had already helped hundreds of people, Robert and Marianne still sat on the veranda in the late afternoon. Same rocking chairs, now worn by years of use. They drank coffee, made the way she had taught in the beginning, when he still pretended to be poor and she still guarded her heart behind high walls. Robert looked at Marianne, white hair shining in the setting sun, the mark on her face that he had learned to love as an essential part of her, and he thought he had been a lucky man, not for the fortune he had inherited, but for the woman he had chosen, for the woman who had chosen him back. Marianne would take his hand without taking her eyes off the horizon. Sometimes she thought of the lonely girl she had been, of the rejected seamstress who expected nothing more from life. And she thanked fate for sending a lying man who hid his identity but couldn't hide his heart, because that heart had seen her when no one else did, had chosen her when no one else chose. And in the end, it didn't matter how it had started. It mattered how it ended. With true love that withstood tests, lies, pains, fears, and all the obstacles the world placed in the path. Love that proved that sometimes the most beautiful stories are born from the most imperfect beginnings, and that people rejected by the world can build entire worlds when they find someone who accepts them completely. Robert and Marianne lived to advanced ages, surrounded by the love they had planted and cultivated their whole lives. And when they departed, they left a legacy that went far beyond lands and buildings. They left a story of second chances, of forgiveness, of love that chooses despite everything. A story the folks of Stony Creek and Birmingham told for generations. The story of the millionaire widower who faked poverty and the rejected seamstress who showed true love. A story that proved the heart always knows how to recognize its home, even when the mind is still confused. And that real love doesn't need tests, because it has already passed the only test that matters, the test of time, of daily choice, of the joint construction of a life worth living.